Gentlemen, the time has come once again to discuss things.
Hi everyone, I am, welcome to another episode of Geeky Gentlemen. I'm Sid Part 2. Joining me today is...
A Geek for Fun.
And Steve Baxi.
I know those guys. My dorky jokes. Anyway, so today we're doing a topic discussion, and the topic was a little bit vague, but it basically came down to the different ways in which horror works in different mediums in which it is used. That's way too long for a title. I'll probably boil it down to something like horror mediums, which sounds more like psychics that are really scary or something. But, you know. Anyway, so it's an interesting topic. It kind of generated from Alfie saying, well, Ian, you've been going through a bunch of horror novels lately, and so wouldn't be interesting to talk about horror as it pertains to prose. And we could certainly start there and maybe spend most of our time there, but it does seem like one of those topics that's going to lend itself to kind of exploring other things. And like, well, it works great in books because it doesn't work the same way in movie or what have you. So I guess we'll start there because, yes, I have been I've been going through so many horror novels lately. I've done a lot of Stephen King. I've done a lot of the classics, your Dracula, your Frankenstein. I've gone through... I went through the entire catalog of H.P. Lovecraft's completed works, minus his collaborations and ghostwritings. And let me tell you, he sucks. Not because of the racism. He's just a really shit writer.
That's not true. That's not true at all.
I did not care for his writing. His prose was pretty fucking awful. The racism was almost like blink and you miss it as far as racist writers, but like his prose was just terrible. But anyway, so I've done just so many horror things. Bill Watherson or whatever, the guy who did Nightmare at 20,000 Feet for the Twilight Zone. There's a Man on the Wing of the Plane. Did a whole novel from him, or not novel, a collection of short stories from him. So yeah, I've just been immersed in a lot of horror literature lately, and it's been fun and hasn't negatively impacted my personality in any way, I'm sure. Meanwhile, my political views have become, maybe people should just die. So I'm
Solve a lot of problems.
Yeah, I'm sure that column A is not affected by column B in one way whatsoever. So yeah, that's kind of where my headspace has been, and I've talked to Alfie and Steve at various points about these things as well. So I'm sure that's influenced the topic of discussion in some way, shape, or form. What's your guys' background on horror prose and horror literature?
So for me, it was something that I didn't really explore at all because I'm not really it was just for the longest time horror wasn't a genre I was particularly interested in, at least in what people presented to me as like, oh, this is a really good horror story, or this is a really good horror movie, or whatever. Like I've never been one that was really interested by gore just kind of boring to me. I've never really found most of like the big like slasher type characters or anything like that particularly interesting. So it wasn't something I was really appealed to until I met my lovely wife, who is mega horror, like all about it. And we about like a year and a half ago at this point, we wanted to start reading more books together. And she's very much into horror novels and horror books. So if she read one that she liked or an author that she'd like, she'd pass it on to me after she was finished with it and be like, "Hey, what do you think of this? I know you don't really check this kind of thing out, but I think the prose here is really, really good." And so I've read more of them through that way, and I've kind of like binged a bunch of them now. I think I've got like about like 5 or 6 under my belt, and then I have more appreciation for like the older stuff that I did check out previously, and now can look at it from a different lens and see that, like the big names like your Draculas and your Frankensteins and so. So it's a more recent thing, but it's one that I think has come at a good period in my life as I've got like more. My understanding and ability to critique and appreciate prose specifically has increased a lot. So by diving into harder material that I wouldn't normally go into, it's kind of expanded my horizons, and I can appreciate things on a different level more, and it makes me think more about things on that line.
How about you, Steve?
I read a lot of horror novels growing up. Less so as I've gotten older, just because most of what I read is I usually don't read a lot of fiction at this point. I read a lot of like history and philosophy and stuff, so I don't read a lot of fiction anymore. But growing up, I read a lot of Stephen King. I used to have all of Stephen King's novels, and I went through all of them in order up through like I want to say like the end of high school or so. When I was a lot younger, what kind of got me into reading was Sherlock Holmes short stories. So a lot of the classic horror short stories by like Edgar Allan Poe would be things that I'd read a lot as a kid. I've always been a guy who's big on classics. I love classics. I tend to spend a lot of my fiction time reading things that are like big monumental classics just because I enjoy that sort of experience. But like more contemporary, more recent stuff, I got into the Children of Chicago series, which has been a really fun horror series of retellings of folk tales from a horror lens, which has been entertaining. Part of what I really like about the older style, though, is that most of the time, horror as a genre didn't exist in those stories the way we kind of do. We put them into now, like Frankenstein being a science fiction story at inception, and then turning into a foundation of Gothic horror. That kind of stuff is really interesting because now when we think about horror, we're thinking about monsters or blood or slashers or jump scares and stuff. But classic horror novels tend to be a lot more slow burn. They tend to be a lot more like psychological thrillers. They tend to be a lot more like idea heavy and stuff. So that kind of thing I always find really interesting. I loved reading Jekyll and Hyde because if you read the short story, or not even really a short story, it's just more like a novella, really. It's less than 100 pages, but you read that, and like the first like chunk of the book is just everyone's varying perspectives on what's happening, and then the end, which is like a good quarter of the story, is just someone explaining to you the events that have unfolded in front of you. And that way, it's a little bit less like that sort of immersive narrative experience that we're used to now, and a lot more sort of just like people are just working out metaphors and ideas and stuff, and it just happens to be in genre fiction, and I really like that.
A lot of the classic stuff I do think is just really strong and is impressive of like the staying power that it has. I mean, it's called the classics for a reason, right? But like one of the things I did was I went through Wells' work. So I did Island of Dr. Moreau.
Oh, hell yeah.
Holy shit, that book is fucked. That one's fucked. And then I went back to what is still like my absolute favorites. These are like two of the greatest stories of all time, and they're just horror stories. Two of the greatest short stories of all time, and that's Monkey's Paw and The Most Dangerous Game. And it pisses me off how The Most Dangerous Game is never adapted properly because no one keeps the ending the same. with the way that like it ends with the guy thinks that he's run him into the swamp and the dogs have got him, so he goes back to his house and he's like disappointed that he won the hunt but he didn't win it the way he wanted to. It wasn't as epic as he wanted it to be. And then just as he's getting ready for bed, he hears the balcony door creak open and he gets up. He's like, I knew you'd do it. I knew you'd make it in here. Oh, you must be tired and so hungry. Well, my bed is warm and there's food right here. And all you have to do is fight for it. And then there's like no description of anything happening. And then you just have the narrator saying, and I've never slept better my entire life. And I'm just like, oh, fuck, man. You turned that man into an animal. It's so good.
Most Dangerous Game is interesting too because like just the basic premise, even if you're not directly adapting that book, has been reused so many times. Like there's obviously the Most Dangerous Game movie adaptations, but then even like movies like Apocalypto or like John Woo's Hard Target, the essential idea of just someone being used as prey in a big game hunt and devolving into an animal as they're being treated like an animal is such a like a staple movie genre at this point that I bet you a lot of people.
Sorry.
I was gonna say I bet you could like watch 100 movies like this and never guess that they were all based on the Most Dangerous Game.
I mean, 100%. Like it's just one of those like it and Groundhog Day kind of and Freaky Friday. It's just like such a good premise that it's like, oh, we can just take our characters and do this. So like it gets adapted into a lot of like adventure TV shows. Like it's I think every series of Star Trek has a Most Dangerous Game adaptation in it.
The premise is the genre, right? Like that's what it becomes at that point.
Yeah. And so it's just such like a fun fucking concept to work in. There are 3 stories: man versus God, man versus man, man versus nature. There's also Freaky Friday, Die Hard, Groundhog Day, and a Most Dangerous Game.
There you go.
Everything comes back to one of these.
See, when they made that quote, they didn't understand the concept of DLC.
Right?
Hey.
Yeah. So like I fucking love those two though. But yeah, like Wells, because he does. You know, Wells is known for his science fiction, like The Time Machine and stuff. But he did, Invisible Man, which is of course a Universal monster. Shortly, like I was a bit shocked to realize how old Wells got, and you think of him as such like a 19th century gentleman, and then you realize that he like died in the 1930s. And it's like, what? It just messes your perception of time a little bit. Because I first realized that because I was reading some Hemingway, and it was like a shitpost novel from Hemingway, and he's like, I was talking with H.G. Wells about you, dear reader. Just imagine that, the two of us talking about you. And I'm like, H.G. Wells met Hemingway? This is so weird to me. And they just chatted about me. How quaint. But like it's such a weird thing. So H.G. Wells wrote Invisible Man, and that got adapted within his life, which is just kind of crazy to think about. That it became a film within his lifetime. And he probably saw it, and I'm curious if he ever wrote anything on it, because it's a weird adaptation. They get most of it right, but they lose something in the translation to film, which is something we're definitely gonna have to talk about and get more into. But like there's a lot of horror in his writing, and I think you're right, Steve, that it's weird to talk about horror as a genre when we're approaching the classics, because no one was really writing for that. They were just kind of writing, and it kind of defined the genre, given the tricks and what they were doing. But what they're writing would be more like romances or like think pieces or just adventure novels or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, you look at Jekyll and Hyde or Dorian Gray, and these are cornerstones of Gothic literature at this point. But you go back and actually read those things, and you remember that like the modern conception of the novel is very different now than it was back then, and how much of those books are just kind of like mood pieces of like, let's just live a day at a time in these characters' heads, and they become vehicles for like individual morality tales that get stitched together into a wider narrative. It's part of why like straight adaptations of those things seem so unappealing to me, because like there is not necessarily a justifiable beginning, middle, and end through line to Dorian Gray that needs to be adapted into an 8-hour BBC miniseries, right? Like the book just doesn't read that way. It's fine for the medium it's in, and if you're going to adapt it, you don't have to treat it like that sort of conventional 3-act structure that we do now, and instead just let it be its own, exactly what it was in the book, which is its own little mood piece. When we were more okay with doing anthology style TV shows where every episode could be its own thing, like The Twilight Zone, that's more of where those kind of classics can live. And it's why so many great horror stories are short stories, like H.P. Lovecraft and Edgar Allan Poe, because you're getting a lot of ethereal concepts that don't have a lot of physical grounding in a very short period of time, and your imagination's doing the work. And the second you turn that into a conventional Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 narrative, it kind of loses its power.
Yeah, I can agree with that completely. I think that comes to just kind of like on a brass tacks level with what I've found as like the main appeal for me is that kind of character work, and it's what I feel like. Genuinely, I think I prefer a horror novel to, like, say, a horror movie or anything like that, because I feel like the strengths of the mystery and the unknown and the stuff that will just remain forever unexplained, and your interpretation of it could be very different from another reader's, because so much of the leg room is like you have to put in yourself. And I think that also makes things scarier, because inherently you have to put part of yourself in these things. It's what it looks like you can get in description, but how this shot is laid out, how people are put together, is going to be scarier in your head than anyone could depict it. And that's not always the case, but by and large it is. And I feel like that opens up a lot of work to interesting character. One of the authors, for a more modern example, that I really like is called Anya Alborn, and she did a couple horror novels, and they're all really good, but the one that stuck out to me was called Brother. And the main draw of that isn't necessarily the scares, because there's kind of like a Texas Chainsaw Massacre type thing with like a family that's like the Texas Chainsaw family, but it's from the perspective of one of the adult sons there and his brother, and how they go out and do these deeds for this family and like kill these people. But it's mostly just character work. You spend a lot of the time in between the kills with this guy in his room thinking about how he's going to talk to the girl he likes, and like fantasizing about having a gentle life, and she works at a record store and he wants to go see her, and he's like nervous about, well, he doesn't know social cues that well, so what if he embarrasses her? But that's cute, so he wants to maybe lean into that a little bit more, but is he doing too much? And then he remembers after all of it, oh, but maybe my mum will eat her. So maybe I shouldn't bring her home. And like stuff like
relatable content.
Right? And it's just like stuff like that I think is really compelling, because it's rooted predominantly in character work, and the horror aspects are really just like visualizing those fears. They're not like actually. The best novels for me, at least, aren't really interested in the brass tacks of, okay, but how would this work if this was real? It's more so like just like, does this reflect our characters and what they're feeling in this moment, and how does that make these emotions like so high-end and intense? And I feel like a lot of the classics do that as well, like Dracula, for example. Really big on how much and how kind of it's never been adapted the way it could be in the book because of this format of it, and it's so individualized and it's so perspective based, and the perspective changes so much, and what you take away from it is going to come entirely from you, and the weird mind of Bram Stoker really struggling with his sexuality and how that comes across in the book, I think is all really interesting stuff that you could only really do in a format like that.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I think kind of differentiates a lot of the like classic horror from some of the more modern stuff is as the genre has become like defined, that it's not, you know, this is a romance novel with some horror tones, it's this is a horror novel, is we've kind of like lost some of the immersive writing that you get into. And I don't know, I'm always so torn on this because for the longest time my perspective has been just get to the point. Just get to what the story's about. We don't need to sit here and play and listen to every detail of these people's lives. And that was like one of my big problems with Lovecraft as I was reading Lovecraft, is so much of it was just padding and didn't mean anything and was more just look at how smart I am. I'm such a better writer than the trappings of what I'm publishing in. And then you get to more modern stuff. I was going through a book called The Unmothers that was about like this weird town where they had like a local fucking demon or eldritch god or some shit, that if a girl went to a spot in the woods and performed a ceremony, if she was pregnant, the demon would take the baby out of her and give it to a horse, and the horse would have the baby, and they could either get the baby and raise it and it would be a human, or if they just left it alone it would turn into a foal, and the horse would just be a mother then instead. But like it required a sacrifice. You had to kill someone that hurt you, that you hated. And in often cases it ended up being the boy that got them pregnant. But it was like a really interesting world and story, but it felt like it was too afraid to spend time building up the characters and really getting into the meat of who these people are. So there's like this interesting scene where the male lead character was this boy that had gotten a girl pregnant, but he was the one that ended up raising the baby because he went and saved it from turning into a horse. And he like just has this passing line of, oh, well, it was all my fault, I forced myself on her. And the female protagonist, who's like this journalist researching this story, was like just so disappointed to find out that, oh, well, he raped her, and he's just so casually admits it. And then it becomes like a plot point later in the book that, you know, he did hurt the mother of this child, blah, 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 that's caused all this thing because the mother hasn't performed the sacrifice. And I'm like, okay, it feels like you tried to say a lot there, but just having the character say this and having the narrator react to it in a certain way doesn't feel like you did the legwork to really establish what happened, because the mother in this situation, the girl that performed the ceremony, she never says anything about it. So we don't really exactly know what happened, because you've set up this like distinction or this incongruity, but you feel like you're too afraid to spend time with it. And either you're too afraid to spend time with it because you think it's boring, you think it's too touchy of a subject, or you're just trying to preserve the mystery. And it doesn't matter what like the reasoning is, it just doesn't quite work, because you're left as a reader with like a dissonance between what you know of the character and what you know of the world and what the other characters are kind of giving you.
There is sometimes this sort of tendency where just because something is spoken or said in a literal sense doesn't mean that the story has done anything to communicate that to you on an emotional level. and so it doesn't matter. And you see this a lot with movies, and a lot of people who will like talk about how relationships in a movie don't work or they don't feel the chemistry, and people will be like, didn't you hear them say this one line about this one thing? I'm like, yeah, sure I did, but like I didn't feel it because the movie didn't spend the time to make me feel it. And sometimes that's very intentional and sometimes it's not. And novels have so much space to do that kind of legwork where even after a line is said, a lot of the job of the prose is to make that mood important or to kind of let your mind swirl in the atmosphere in a way that you don't with a movie. So where you and I disagree on the Lovecraft thing is I think Lovecraft does a very good job of making things that are very mundane sound very ethereal and interesting as a way to kind of make his monsters or his darkness even more unimaginable or difficult. There's a bit in a Cormac McCarthy novel called The Orchid Keeper, which is not a horror novel in the sense that it's fits into the horror genre, but it is a horror novel in the sense that you are going to be horrified after it's over emotionally.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought you were gonna just like make a joke about how bad it is.
No, it's definitely his weakest novel, but it is also, it's like by the time it's over, you're just like, fuck, man, I'm just gonna take a cold shower for like 20 minutes and think about my life. But there's a bit at the end, and basically the setup for the Orchid Keeper is essentially just there is a guy who shoots someone else and then runs into town after like committing a robbery or something. And when he starts to hide out, he befriends a kid who turns out to be the son of the man he killed. And the whole book is just like their relationship. And then at the end, when the kid finds out and he runs away, and there's kind of an epilogue where he comes back to the town that he abandoned after learning the truth about his dad, and he finds like a headstone. And essentially, the world that he knew as a kid had disappeared, and he came back and he finds this headstone. And in this moment, he's kind of trying to find some semblance of the past. And McCarthy has this line when the kid reaches out to the headstone, and I'm just going to read it real quick because it's so fucking good. But he says, he reached out and patted the stone softly, a gesture, as if perhaps to conjure up some image, evoke again some allegiance with a name, a place, hallucinated recollections in which faces merged inextricably and yet true and fixed. Touched it, a carved stone less real than the smell of wood smoke or the taste of an old man's wine. And he no longer cared to tell which were things done and which dreamt. And that to me is very easily, you could just say he came back to a world he'd no longer recognized, and he wasn't sure whether he wanted to believe it never existed or hold on to the hope that it did. But the way he defamiliarizes that situation, the way he's able to make you feel the kind of abyss between reaching out from where you are into your past and just kind of sit there and muse for a second about what this gesture means before he hits you with that ending sentence of, does it really matter one way or the other? That's the kind of thing that I think novels can really do. They can be kind of meditative in that sense. And that's also what's so great about Lovecraft to me, because so many of his short stories and so many of his novels will just have paragraphs on end where he's just talking about how this feels or what this would mean or how he thinks about this situation. He's not even narrating the story at a point. He's just like talking. And when he does that, it really kind of grounds you in this idea of what he's talking about is an experience I get. But the way he's saying it is making me take a second look at what this experience is, and I'm not taking it for granted anymore. And that's what I love about like a good classic.
I'm gonna have to agree to disagree. Part of what like became really apparent to me with the Lovecraft thing as I was going through it is every like story would have, you know, a 3-4 paragraph introduction, just kind of like letting you know what was going on with Lovecraft in his life during the time of this this was written and when it finally got published and where things were. And it just became incredibly apparent that this was like a guy who was really bitter about being unsuccessful, even though he was successful within what he was doing, but he just wasn't happy with the work that he was doing, and like thought that he was so much better than the work he was putting out. So he like kept intentionally trying to make his stories and his writing excel past what other people in the genre, what his peers, as far as publishing were writing. And it just became very, very apparent within understanding that context and reading the story that, like, he just wanted to be seen as like some kind of literary genius, when really what he was writing was fairly clever pulp stuff. And so I just got... it irked me in a certain way, because I just don't like people like that in general. But that's
the racism doesn't help either.
The racism doesn't help either. It's like, you can't even really feel bad for the dude, because then he'll, like, there'll be all this, and then he'll just, like, name a dude's cat N-word man. That's just the literal name of a cat. It's because it's a black cat. It's just called N-word man. And I'm like...
For the sake of our runtime and our friendship, I won't read the Lovecraft quote that I had marked for this video. That's okay.
No.
Wonderful.
Go ahead, do it.
That's very smart.
Do it, Steve. Pull the trigger, I dare you.
Okay. I mean, if you say so, I've got it.
All right. And don't censor any of the slurs. Don't worry, I'm totally a careful enough editor that I'll catch it.
But I pulled Call of Cthulhu because I really like that story, and the first paragraph of it I really love, because he's clearly talking about something that makes a lot of sense in like a philosophical sense, but it became so much more true as the decades went on that I just kind of have it bookmarked permanently. But the first paragraph of Call of Cthulhu has: the most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but someday the piercing together of disassociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. And every time I read that, I'm just like, man, that's the world. That's just everything right now.
I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't like Lovecraft's complete works. I do still think The Colors Out of Space is one of the greatest horror stories ever told.
Oh, so
and
good.
Call of Cthulhu is pretty good. At the Mountains of Madness, like, he still had his hits, but we're talking about a career over like 20 to 30 years, depending on how far back you want to go. And I literally just named all of his best stories.
He's not your guy. That definitely makes sense.
Yeah. So I don't know. It's just a thing. Like, Call of Cthulhu is probably the weakest of those. Is the funny thing, because Lovecraft, funny enough, in relation to this topic, did like a whole fucking like doctorate paper basically for just fun on what the evolution of horror in prose has been, and how it went from, as we were talking about earlier, like just part of a different kind of novel, whether that be romance, adventure, yada yada, and kind of became a genre in and of itself, and the merits therein. And it's like this like 20,000 word doctorate paper, and he comes to like some conclusions, and then he goes off and he writes the Call of Cthulhu, and like the completed works felt the need that this was so formative to Lovecraft's evolution of style that they had to include it, even though it's not like a completed works of letters and writings. It was just as fiction, and that was all really interesting, well and good, and it was cool to see that being his development and changing point as a writer. And then it was incredibly sad to see that the writing didn't get significantly better after that. It just got a little bit more grounded. Shadow of Innsmouth was also pretty good. But then the thing that really just cracked me up as I was going through this fucking doctorate paper is like 90% of it was just YouTube reviewer, like early day YouTube reviewer, where they just summarized the movie. It's like, in this horror story, X, Y, and Z happens. And in this horror story, A, B, and C happens. And in this horror story, I'm like, what are your conclusions? You don't need to summarize every single horror story that has ever existed in your paper. You should just assume that people have read them. It's so silly to me. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But it was quite interesting to see that, like, writing evolution from Lovecraft and that summation on horror as a genre. And I was really hoping to see more of a upgrade in the craft of Lovecraft than I think ended up coming out of it by the time it was all said and done. But that kind of, I think, would lead to a good point to talk about the other stuff here, which is what is lost, particularly in adaptations of horror. Steve and I were talking about this the other night with King, how he really shouldn't complain about any of the adaptations of his work, given that so many of them are some of the best horror films ever made.
Some of them are, like, literally some of the best movies ever made.
Right?
Look, man, if this dude had Carrie and The Dead Zone and The Shining all come out in quick succession, I would just never complain. It's ridiculous to me.
Yeah, like, I remember finding out a factoid about it as I was going through Christine, that before he was even done writing the book, the studios had already bought, or studios were already fighting over the movie rights for who would get to adapt it, because he was just that hot at that point in his career, which is kind of wild, because he has become a bit of a parody of himself in a lot of ways. I remember the Family Guy joke, I think, has always stuck in my mind about Stephen King of, so what do you got for me? There's a couple and they're attacked by a, looks around the room, a deadly lamp monster. You're just running out of ideas, aren't you? Rah, rah, rah. When can you have it to me? And I think there's probably more truth in that than King would want to admit necessarily, but it's just it's funny to see King has become a parody of himself in some ways, but at the same time going through his stuff, and it is still amazingly effective. Recently I finished Pet Sematary by King, and that is one of the ones where not only is the novel great, but the adaptation is great, and the adaptation sticks shockingly close to the novel. They don't spend as much time on a lot of the stuff that King does, and I would argue that a lot of the true horror of that comes from the fact that King does have you spend so much time getting to know and kind of understand this family, but also in, like, Pet Sematary is a really interesting deconstruction of what it means to be a father. The soil of a man's soul is stonier. It's just such a good fucking line.
And Pet Sematary is one of the few movies that he had direct involvement in and even wrote the script.
Yeah, and he also cameos in it.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting one. And, you know, he is, like, you know, he has the perfect name for it, obviously, but he has been called the King of Horror, and there's a good reason for it, because no one before King had, like, properly made a career out of being a horror writer and be, like, commercially successful. There are people that did. Lovecraft was known as a horror writer, but he also died broke, you know? And so it's interesting that King has become so successful out of doing it, and the adaptations of his work have been, you know, sometimes not as faithful as others, but have been so wildly successful on the whole. That like the man has really like locked in on something, which is not to say that he's above reproach, because I'm currently working my way through The Talisman, which he co-wrote with Peter Straub, and I have gotten a little tired of King. You can forgive it to a certain extent because of things like the time it was written or whatever, or like sometimes a writer just falls into the trap of writing in a trope. But I'm on like my fifth magical Negro from Stephen King, and I know I've still got the Green Mile to come, and I'm just like, man, you really over rely on this, and it's becoming really, really bad, because you got Dick Halloran from The Shining, and you got Mother Abigail, and now I'm in The Talisman, and you've got Speedy Parker, and then I've still got John Coffey to come up, and I'm like, how many more fucking black people are you gonna have just solve all of the protagonist problems and then die?
Take a shot for every Stephen King novel about a writer from Maine who might be an alcoholic.
Yeah, no, for sure. Like, he falls into his tropes, but King is also interesting in that he makes a really good point in regards to letting a story breathe and like letting characters just have time to themselves. Steve, you're right. He should not be critical of his adaptations because they're all so successful, but he is critical of them because he, as a novelist, just really likes to take time with stuff. And I can't deny that time does usually pay off, because as much as I like a lot of the adaptations of King's work, and early on in reading through King's stuff, I'm like, I like the adaptations more because sometimes his ideas are just stupid by comparison to what was adapted. Dude, okay. When I tell you that in The Shining, there's two versions. There's the Kubrick film, and then there's the book. And they both deal with the hedges. And in the Kubrick film, it is the hedge maze that is changing without you seeing it happen, and is kind of looming as this ever-present threat where the climax of the movie ends up, and that's where Jack Torrance dies. And that's really haunting and creepy, and it's just meant to be there the whole movie, and it's very unsettling. And then you have the novelization, where there is no hedge maze, but there are animal sculptures made out of hedges. And in the book, they fucking come alive when you're not looking at them and attack you. And I'm sorry, but that's dumb in comparison to how it's handled in the fucking movie.
So the part of the reason I joke, but I'm not being entirely joking when I say Stephen King shouldn't complain about his adaptations. Part of the reason I say that is Stephen King is a master of his craft. He is a novel writer that is very prolific. He knows his lane. He knows his genre inside and out. He writes a specific number of words per day, every single day. He's got it down to a science. And his novels, while some can be hit or miss later in his life, are largely based on what his style is. Very good to pretty good. Carrie's good. Shining's good. Cujo's good, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He's a good writer. The thing about the Stephen King movies, though, is unlike a lot of book adaptations that just get sold to movie studios and then given to work for hire directors, Stephen King has the luxury of so many of his books being put in the hands of directors who are equally, if not more so, talented in their craft for making movies. So as good as Stephen King is of writing a horror novel, Brian De Palma is as making a movie. Same with Stanley Kubrick, even more so as far as filmmaking goes, or John Carpenter, or whoever the guy who directed Misery is, because I can't remember his name. It's been a minute since I've had a chance to look up this stuff. Yeah, but with Stephen King movies, Carrie, The Shining, Dead Zone, Christie, Misery, all of these movies are not just good adaptations, but they're like linchpin moments in the careers of these directors. They're doing things that they haven't done before. They're evolving things that they've maybe tried before. They're also in their style. Like Carrie is kind of like the quintessential De Palma movie. And there's so much stuff that he does in that film that whether or not it's accurate to the book is mesmerizing as part of his style. And so like part of the reason I say Stephen can't complain is that De Palma and Kubrick and John Carpenter and them, they make as good as movies as they've ever made, and they just so happen to be based on Stephen King novels. Mm-hmm. And a lot of horror writers don't have that luxury. There's so many adaptations of books that are just like crappy, trying to go through the plot of the book as soon as possible to turn it into a franchise Hunger Games style kind of bullshit. Mm-hmm. And Stephen King didn't ever have to worry about that, right? Stephen King came out of the gate swinging in the 70s with Carrie, and then it just never let up. Even like recent stuff like Dr. Sleep, right? Like he's so lucky to get his books adapted by people that know how to make movies and not people that are subservient to his prose as if a literal adaptation is a good adaptation.
Mm-hmm. No, I'd agree with that.
I agree as well.
It's just interesting to see the way that like Stephen King really likes to just kind of fuck around for an hour or for like a chapter and just talk and stuff. Like what was it? The Body adapted into Stand By Me, and it's so funny that this even gets adapted into the film. There's just like a whole chapter that there's two. They only adapt one. Where the character is a writer, the main character is a writer, reflecting on when he and his friends walked down the train tracks for like 3 days to go find a dead body that they knew where it would be. And they like stop and they camp out, and he like tells a story because he was a writer even from that age, and then it just like breaks for a chapter to tell the story, so you get like The Revenge of Lardass, which is about a dude with a glandular problem who like takes revenge on the town for making fun of him during a pie eating contest and just like causes everybody at the pie eating contest to vomit because he starts vomiting. It's like gross. And they fucking adapted in the movie, but it's just such a King moment of, yeah, this is kind of like a funny little side chapter. It's whatever. You're already here for the journey. It's fine. To like, they put it in the movie. It's like, okay, but like, did it actually add anything, or is it just fucking weird, gross little side stuff? Why was this here?
If you compare like the Salem's Lot movie that Tobe Hooper did to the Salem's Lot movie that came out like just last year, that's another really good example of like what happens when you get a director who's a good director to make a movie versus we want to cash in on the fact that Stephen King has a really big name, so we're going to make another adaptation of Salem's Lot. The Salem's Lot movie that came out last year is not terrible, but it's so like instantly forgettable that I promise you most people forgot already that there was a Salem's Lot movie last year, even if they saw it. But then like the Tobe Hooper movie, right? Like that's one of those things where you see him coming off the success of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You see him cultivating his style in making that kind of movie. And that movie becomes as important to his filmography as the book was to Stephen King's career. And that's just a rare thing when it comes to most adaptations, because we're, as audiences, we're so like predisposed to say like, if it adapted the thing accurately, then it's good, as opposed to just letting the thing be what it needs to be in that medium. Anime fans are notorious for this, where it's like, that didn't happen in the manga. Like, okay, but was it good in the manga? Because probably not.
Yeah, and that's like a wider discussion of what the strengths and weaknesses are in adaptations. Because I think, like, as many times as we've had the, oh, thank God they changed this, or this wasn't even good in the original anyway, so this is a good change, or, oh, that was a brilliant change. There's also, like, I think everyone can name a time where they're like, why the fuck would you cut that? Mine is famously that the fucking idiot that adapted Dark Knight Returns never should have gotten rid of the internal monologue.
Oh, the
because
voiceover, yeah.
yeah, it fucking
Yeah.
ruins it. When you turn that into dialogue, it doesn't work. It's not the same. And so like you always kind of have that thing of that rocky ground of adaptation. Where yeah, making a change could be a brilliant change, or it could be the worst fucking thing anyone's ever done.
um, to kind of get back on topic real quick, just to talk about like horror movies or as a horror medium. Another thing that kind of irks me about a lot of horror movies lately is we've kind of like narrowed horror down to does it have jump scares or not, and that gets kind of silly and boring because I feel like so many of my favorite horror movies are not jump scare kind of movies. They're mostly like things that are just like eerie or atmospheric or things that have like a particularly sinister mood. I was talking to a friend at work the other day, and we had both seen the new Wolfman movie that came out, and I was talking about how much I hated it. I thought it was just like the dumbest movie ever. And then they were telling me like, but yeah, but like, weren't you scared when he jumped out of that thing? And I'm like, no, no, I wasn't. And even if I was, it doesn't make it better.
Jump scares are an interesting one because it is a technique that's almost exclusive to a film. You know, you can make the case that you can get a jump scare to work like in a comic book and maybe in like, you know, an audio adaptation of something. Like we do a radio drama, you could do a big scary sound effect or something. But it doesn't ever hit the same as even like the most basic ass fucking sci-fi original movie kind of jump scare that you can throw in on a film. It just doesn't work the same outside of that.
And disparaging the Wolfman movie aside, jump scares can be a lot of fun. Like, there's nothing wrong with jump scares. It's just a matter of like utilizing them in ways that are good. Like, I always think about the one in Insidious where the dude's turning his head and then right behind him is like the fucking Darth Maul looking motherfucker right before the camera cuts. That's fucking terrifying.
Yeah. No, I like a good jump scare, but I think it can very quickly become a crutch.
Yeah, for sure.
To just keep the audience on edge. I don't know. I'm seeing trailers for the new Final Destination movie. That is, of course, using the viral anxiety song now in the marketing, and I'm like, okay, we've reached this point. Because Final Destination was kind of like always like Final Destination has always been just fucking junk food of horror movies for me, but at the same time it has undeniably scarred a generation because no one that has seen even the trailer for that one Final Destination movie has the balls to drive behind a logging truck. Tell me I'm wrong. So it's just interesting to see like the way that jump scares can be utilized in horror films, and you can't get that. It's tapping into such a different part of the brain because like as King would talk about with, oh, you just get time with characters and to spend that time is valuable. And I would agree with him. There is something to the immediacy of hitting on kind of that literal physical fight or flight response that you can do as a filmmaker with the jump scare that you can't do as a novelist. But at the same time, at least for me personally, I've never like felt physically uncomfortable to the point where I felt like I was going to actually throw up if I did not stop watching the movie, the way I have with multiple novels. I remember reading a horror book in high school that was all about, like, I can't remember the fucking name of it, but the premise was that a religious nut serial killer, his blood was so hyperactive, his white blood cells were so hyperactive that they were literally, like, curing cancer, but he was on death row. And so it became like a whole thing of to try to get his blood and bone marrow samples and stuff before the state killed him. And to even consider like lobbying to keep him alive, but then like he escapes. And the scene where he escapes is they're doing a bone marrow withdrawal. and he's refused any kind of medication for it because like his religious beliefs, and then he just goes into anaphylactic shock in the middle of the withdrawal, and it was the most disturbing thing I've ever read, as the writer just describes every process of the body going into anaphylactic shock. That, like, I remember just trying to read it during like free reading time in class in high school, and I was like literally like sweating, and I had to put the book down and ask to go to the bathroom, and I just was like standing above the fucking toilet for like 10 full minutes just trying not to fucking throw up as my mind kept replaying all of the information that I was reading. I'm like, I know people have had this with films, so it's certainly your mileage may vary, but just personally, I think that the level of detail and the level of disgust you can drive the human brain to by forcing it to inflict it upon itself in reading horror is fairly unique to the prose format, and you can't quite get to that level of disgust with a film, no matter how fucking like gory you get or whatever. It's really hard to get to that level. God, I wish I could remember the name of that book to never ever read it again.
Hello.
Get it for everybody for Christmas. Just mail copies.
Right. That's my evil supervillain plan. Is I'm just gonna like put that book in everybody's fucking mailbox.
Oh man.
Anyway, so we were planning to talk more about other mediums and stuff, and we still got like a bit of the episode to go, so we can definitely still talk about this. We've talked about film a little bit, so let's transition and talk a little bit more about what are the strengths to horror in film in particular. Besides just, they could do jump scares.
I think a lot of it actually comes down to music. It's not, for me, it's never the gore or the monster or the way the story is structured or anything like that. Because like you can mimic a lot of that genre stuff in novels and film just in different ways. But music really adds a whole different layer to it. And I've never seen a bad horror movie with a good score, and I've never seen a good horror movie with a bad score. It's always down to how are they able to drive the momentum of the scene, or how is the absence felt, or how is the sound kind of queuing you up for the bigger emotions. I mean, famously, John Carpenter's whole thing about the Halloween theme and how it's on a weird time signature, and that kind of puts you on edge, and how many horror movie scores since then have kind of copied that same format. And if you're really good at living in those moments, a lot of horror movies don't have to have jump scares. They just kind of have to leave the shot and keep the music running and kind of just let the dread sort of seep in. I was listening to a podcast with Roger Deakins, just talking about directing with other people, or talking about like editing and cinematography with other people, and he was talking about how his favorite director is the kind of person who never moves the camera. It's always just kind of in the same place, and everyone's just always walking in and out of the frame. And one of the things that's really interesting about that is there's kind of the two schools of thought of like, do you want to cut quickly or do you want to hold the shot really long? But the kind of trick to holding a shot for a long time is you have to hold it long enough so that the audience recognizes what's happening in the frame. Then you have to hold it a little bit longer to make the person watching think, why are we still here? And then you have to hold it a little bit longer after that so that their mind resets and they start thinking, okay, if we're here for a reason. And then they're looking at it through a different lens. And then you cut, because you want to go through that whole sort of like moment of appreciating what's happening. And a lot of, like, in my opinion, a lot of really good horror movies like The Shining, movies like Halloween, movies like Hereditary or The Witch, they're really good at doing that. They're really good at keeping you in a scene, because the longer the scene goes on and the more the actors and the atmosphere have chemistry and the more tension builds, the more doing a cut is actually an escape from the tension of the moment, because it changes the framing and it lets you breathe for a second to kind of regroup on the next scene. Even if it's a tense scene, every time you cut, you're giving the audience a moment to pause and readjust to the next scene and readjust to the atmosphere. So the more you hold it, the more it's like everyone in the frame is just trapped there. And so if you hold it just right, then when you do finally cut, you can hit on a much bigger beat or hit on a much bigger scare. And that kind of thing is not possible in a novel. They obviously do it different ways, but like the way you can create horror by just allowing yourself to slowly recontextualize the images you're looking at feels like a very different thing that has a very similar effect to what you were talking about before.
Mm-hmm. Alfie, what do you think some of the strengths of horror on film in particular are?
I think the opposite of what my previous answer was as like a strength in novels, where I was just like, oh, nothing will ever be scarier than your imagination. Right? Sometimes that's not true. Sometimes a talented person is way more creative than you'll ever be and actually does know how to film the shot and make it more interesting than a person who doesn't know how to create terror just reading a book will ever be able to depict. So I think craft and skill of like getting to see like a master at work a lot of the times will by far trump any person's imagination. One of my favorite examples of this is the depiction in Nosferatu, the recent movie that came out by Eggers, of the approach to Dracula's castle. I thought was like something that I'd never seen someone interpret in that way, where the looming dread of going there and the horses arriving in front of you and just the darkness of all of it being so captivating and so mesmerizing. I'd never seen anyone take that material from that part of the novel and depict it in such a way like that. So I feel that was an absolute showcase of when someone knows what they're doing, it's gonna beat the bricks out of anything that you could come up with, or even the author writing the novel. Because again, if you write a novel, you're going to get a bit of an ego about it, especially if it's highly regarded. Like if it's a bestseller, it's something that's viewed as something, you're going to get some pride to it. And I feel like when another artist touches that and makes different choices, a lot of people, like you mentioned with Stephen King, are going to be like, oh, well, no, it has to be worse because it's different from my choice that was made that was good, and you can't have both things be good in different ways or for different mediums, etc. So I feel like another part of that that comes with being on film, I think, is just some visceralness that you can't quite get. Like movies are way more easy to get. It's way easier in a movie to make you feel something immediately in a scene. It's way easier in a movie to give you a clue that lays subconsciously without you realizing it. In a novel, it's really hard to set something up without the person realizing that you're setting it up. That requires a lot more skill than just having something in frame, and then continuously building up to that. So there's a lot. I don't say it's easier, but I feel like the hardest parts aren't necessarily the parts that you have to stress over as much when you're making a film. You have different problems in just, it's much harder in a movie to get the buy-in the whole way through, where in a novel, people are way more easy to give you, they'll give you a lot more grace because most people aren't going to finish a novel in one sitting. They're kind of expecting to get themselves in that headspace and then leave it. In a movie, 9 times out of 10, especially a horror movie, people want to be in that scared space the entire time, or at least the majority of it. And if you break that, you're never getting it back, and it's immediately ruining the illusion of the whole thing. So that's a lot less forgiving than it is in a novel, where in a novel, if something doesn't quite work with the next chapter or stuff, someone will just put the book down and come back to it later. There's more chances to impress people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely the time you have in a novel versus the movie. You have to be more active with a movie. I think for me, one of the things you kind of touched on a little bit, Alfie, but I want to talk about something outside of not outside of the filmmaker's control, but less dependent on the filmmaker and more about the fact that film is inherently collaborative. And that's just the fact that when you're making a film, you are working with other people, and so it's not just about the filmmaker's vision, but one of the things that is the most particularly impressive about film is the actor's performance of whatever you've written. Sometimes you can have something that is just like on a script level crap or mediocre or what have you, but a performance can take it up to, just absolutely captivating. Similar to what you were saying with, well, someone can just be more imaginative than you. Yeah, it's all well and good to come out of a movie and go, oh, well, the book was better. You got to fill it all in with your imagination, so nothing can really compare. I'm like, yeah, but also nothing can compare to the fact that, like, an actor, a person who is, like, made a career out of learning to convey emotions and present ideas through a character, can have a much more fully fleshed out idea and present a character better than you could ever conceivably imagine them. So you get this a lot of times. I don't have a great horror example off the top of my head, but like Heath Ledger's performance change to the Joker was probably forever, at least as far as live action goes. I don't think we're ever getting away from what the fuck what that man did for that character in live action. And the whole slasher genre that existed in the 80s is basically all down to the performances that the various actors gave. Freddy would not be the icon he is if not for the performance that Robert Englund gave to that character, the way that he breathed life into that character. And I just find that, really, really fascinating. The
There's
way
also
that an actor can heighten the material.
There's also like that sort of very basic human idea of like when you're watching a person express an emotion, you're more likely to empathize with them as opposed to trying to bring that with you when you're reading a book. Hereditary has a scene where after a little girl dies, Toni Collette is grieving her daughter and she's crying on the floor. And I've talked to so many people over the years who, like, even if they don't like that movie, they just can't watch that scene because the weight of how she does it and just how traumatizing it is to think about, and her scream and her word choice, it's so visceral that it just kind of breaks you even if you don't like the movie. And that's just not a thing you get anywhere else outside of a solid performance. Even when you're talking about like just like iconic personalities like Freddy Krueger, but like also like the Crypt Keeper, right? In Tales from the Crypt, there's just something about a way a performance can kind of set the tone for you or be that sort of reset point as you keep watching. Halloween works because there is no empathy to latch onto when you look at Michael Myers, and that's not an experience you can have writing him on a prose novel or putting him in a comic book, because the fact that he is a person that with nothing to latch onto is why visually the movie works.
Yep. Which is interesting to talk about with someone with characters like Michael Myers and Jason, because those are all, throughout the course of their many sequels, those are often played by completely different actors, but there is somehow this, like, really impressive consistency to the character that, like, not any one actor sets. Of like, oh, well, if you don't do this, then you're just not going to be as good as the other person. Like, when really it's just tall, burly man walks intimidatingly, So,
it's funny. I know we're probably going a little late, but I'll make
You're
this
fine.
quick. But there's a funny thing. So in the original Halloween, fucking Michael Myers is played by Nick Castle, and every time you listen to like interviews or read about the filming of the movie, everyone's like, John Carpenter didn't give Nick Castle any direction whatsoever, with the exception of one scene where he stabs a dude and pins him to a wall, and then Carpenter tells Castle to like tilt his head left and right so that he looks at the person he killed, kind of like curious or sort of admiring, just kind of like a weird sort of like, what did I do here kind of head tilt. And it's a really standout moment in the movie because it's the only time in the movie where you feel like he's doing anything close to emoting. And ever since then, every Halloween movie since, somebody has this motherfucker try and do the same thing, and it never works the same way. Like, at least with Jason, you don't really have like a distinct mannerism they're always trying to copy. But with something
they
about
don't.
Michael Myers, there's always something about like everyone wants their version of that, and no one can ever get it right.
Yeah, it's just a part of how it goes. What can you do? That's funny. Like, no, I need you to tilt your head like you did in the one scene.
He does like sort of a wrestler move in a later movie that gets copied a lot too, but that's less impressive.
Yeah. There is some to the fact that, like, a lot of those ones just, I just want to see him fight! Yeah. I guess something else to talk about in film is, it's not that it's, like, exclusive to film, but it's certainly more, I guess, feasible. I don't know. Which is the idea of the sequel. Not that, like, horror films are particularly well known for their brilliant sequels left, right, and center, but, you know, there is something to the fact that people like the slasher villain, insert slasher villain here, and they will often have a favorite film of the franchise, and it usually isn't the first one, which is usually actually the best one. So I'm going to say the word that I know Steve just loves with all his heart. The franchisement of horror films is something that seems not exclusive to film, but more film friendly. And that might just be from a business standpoint, but for some reason, it does seem to work a little bit better. I will watch every fucking Nightmare movie, but I doubt you could get me to read, the 13th Nightmare on Elm Street novel or what the fuck ever, if it kept, or like Stephen King's The Shining 12, which is funny because he did actually make a sequel to The Shining, but still.
Yeah, the movie sequels, whenever you get a sequel to a horror movie, you kind of know what you're in for, which is just going to be like schlocky B-movie quality. And in the case of like the early slashers, it was sort of like we know this was supposed to be a one-off thing, but we have to kind of force it to keep going, and we're going to spend the sequels trying to find our new audience. So like Friday the 13th, for example, famously, Jason's not the killer in the first one. He is the killer in the second one, but he doesn't have a hockey mask in the second one. And it's not really until the third one that Jason is who we think of as Jason. Or Friday the 13th, like, a lot of people love the original, but then the sequel is a really weird sort of body horror movie with Freddy. And then the third one is when the movies start actually becoming what people remember Freddy for.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It's interesting. I just dig it. Fucking love the fact that we get a billion sequels to horror movies, and they get like progressively worse. Like almost as a rule.
It's like Highlander. It cannot be better than the last one.
Yeah.
Man, Highlander. Oh,
I love those movies, man. They're so bad.
Okay. So we talked about film, we talked about prose. Do we want to talk just briefly before we wrap up about horror in comics and horror in like audio productions, or do we think those are like kind of niche enough that they're not really worth discussing within the genre?
I read a lot of horror comics, so I'm always down to talk about those if you guys are.
Yeah. I do like horror in comics, but it doesn't... I think it is telling that they're something that have trouble consistently selling, I do think that is telling that as, like, a limitation of the genre, that they have a hard time kind of defining themselves and being like a consistent book. Horror, it's funny, we began the thing by talking about how in prose horror kind of became its own genre, evolving out of other things, whereas in comics it's rare to find a book that is just horror, and it's more that like existing, things have to incorporate horror elements. So you get like a Batman arc or something that's like really, really based in horror, as opposed to just the consistently well-selling horror book.
I think that's changed quite a bit in the last like 10 years or so, to the point where I think horror comics are probably the most consistent thing you're going to see on the shelf that isn't just superhero stuff at this point. Most indie comics kind of come in waves, right? Like there was a bit where everyone was trying to do their alternate version Superman book or Spider-Man book. There was a phase where everyone was trying to do hard fantasy stuff. And then now we're sort of in a phase where everyone's trying to do their horror book. And so there's just dozens of horror books on the stands, that to the point where certain writers' whole reputation is that they do the indie horror thing. Colin Bunn is that guy now. Like he got big on working for Marvel, but everything he does now is like adaptations of like Arkham Horror, Call of Cthulhu stuff. Scott Snyder, when he's not doing DC stuff, he's doing independent horror comics. James Tynion's whole brand is that he's got a new horror comic out like every 6 months, and he sells probably the most of any direct market person at this point, just because he's kind of got his style down to a science, where all of his number one issues are always selling like 200, 300,000 copies. And a lot of those horror books have the same problem as a lot of superhero books do, which is they're just kind of like fill in the blank horror twist on thing you might know. But that's not to say that there aren't a lot of really great horror comics out there. One I really, really love that came out a few years ago is called The Me You Love in the Dark. And that's a fun one because that's a series. I want to say it's like 4 or 5 issues, but that's by Scotty Young, and everyone knows Scotty Young for doing like those little chibi style Marvel variant covers. But that turned out to be like a really good sort of twisted gothic romance kind of story. Emily Carroll does some incredible horror comics. A Guest in the House was one she did a couple years ago, and I adore that book. That's one of my favorite comics of all time. And the way she's able to use the paneling to help you figure out how characters are isolated, or the little quirks in the lettering to sort of see how people are not able to communicate with each other. That kind of stuff I really love. Something with horror comics is you don't have jump scares, you don't have music, and you don't have like the dense prose of a novel. So you're really limited by how you can structure the page to tell the story. And with a lot of really good horror comics, what they'll do is they'll weaponize the page turn of when you get from the bottom corner to the next page, are we setting you up to transition to that next page smoothly, or is there going to be something jarring? And when they do that page turn, since you don't get the same effect as a jump scare, what you'll have sometimes, like in Department of Truth, for example, you'll have a page that you're flipping into that is just dense in word balloons. And then the page right next to it that you're seeing in your peripheral vision will have the haunty, scary picture. So you're turning, you're getting hit with that image, but you're not there yet. And then you're reading, and you're slowly building this anticipation of, oh God, I have to look at that thing. Oh God, I have to look at that thing. And you're stuck in that moment. And it just becomes this sense of anxiety leading up to the scary image that becomes the way the scare happens. And I find that really interesting.
Yeah. I don't know. I like horror comics, but I always feel a level of detachment from them that I don't when I'm like watching horror movies or reading horror prose. And I don't know what that is. Maybe I just haven't read enough good ones. There's been like stuff I quite liked though as I've gone on and done stuff. Like there was a book I quite enjoyed called Predator Hunters, where the premise was the predators are actually kind of just shit at, you know, actually clearing up and killing the humans they're hunting. So there always ends up being like just that one dude that survived and killed the predator. And so it's just a team of the people that have survived, and they go around and fucking find predators to kill. And I thought that was such just a fun premise, and it had like really good scenes in it. But I don't remember like really feeling the horror in those scenes or in those moments. And not that it wasn't still good, but it just didn't have like a scare factor to me. And so I don't know, I go back and forth on things, and I'm not ever sure how I feel about horror in comics. It's like weird because I love Tales from the Crypt, but I haven't been around for a successful Tales from the Crypt run. They just kind of existed previously, and I'll read like the greatest hits of them, and that feels like almost an unfair level to compare to. Of, well, here's the best things ever written. Wasn't this such a shame that it was lost in the genre? Well, maybe not, because you throw enough stuff at the wall, eventually something's gonna stick. So I don't know, I guess I need to, like, find out, or reach out and find some, like, great horror comics and really give it, you know, a proper shake, because I really like the Chilling Adventures of Sabrina Netflix series, and I know those were based on a comic run, and so maybe that's, like, a good place to start for me.
I would highly recommend reading Me You Love in the Dark. Just a great little horror gothic romance comic. And then A Guest in the House is like perfection. I've gotten that book as a gift for multiple people. It's so good. But if you're into like horror comics that are sort of less like jump scary monster ones and more just like about relationships or gothic romances or that kind of thing, I think you would dig those.
Perhaps. Perhaps. Alright. Alfie, what are your thoughts on horror in comics?
I think a lot of them have been pretty interesting. I've seen a couple of webtoons. I've read some of the Tinian horror comics. The ones that I think the most effective that I've seen sometimes are like on Twitter. You'll just get like a random like single page or like couple panels of like an artist with their portfolio that's doing like a horror thing, and it's like normally really effective imagery where it's almost very little to no dialogue, but it's just visuals, and you just go from bit to bit to bit, and then you end on kind of like a haunting image. And I think the format you receive those in helps sell it a little bit, because I kind of had the thing you do, Ian, where it's like it's a little hard to get as invested in them. But I think when you have something that's fully, it almost feels like you're not supposed to look at it. It almost has this kind of like, you just stumbled upon this in the wild, cursed DVD tape, like creepypasta quality to something. I think that's when things get kind of interesting with horror comics, because it feels like has an energy to it. Webtoons, I think, are particularly effective with that, because you're kind of forced to focus on panel to panel when you're reading it on like your phone or a browser. And so you get what Steve mentioned, you get that like anticipation building to building, because you're not allowed to look away from any other part of the scene. You have to just click through panel to panel to panel to panel. And I think that's very effective, especially for something like coming towards you, or you can effectively get a jump scare out of it at that point, which I think is very impressive, the artists that I've managed to see do that. And they're often Korean artists who just will draw the most insane, haunting depictions of like people being possessed or out of their own body, and like an Uzumaki style thing. So those are the type of like horror comics that I lean towards. I also like crime horror comics quite a lot, where it's just an excuse to be able to do a crime story and depict it properly. Like the name's escaping me at the moment, but Steve and I were reading one that Tinian did, and it was about like a Santa Claus type killer.
The Deviant?
Yeah, and I thought that was really strong. I need to finish that because it was coming out as I was reading it.
Finish that, I think.
It's not over yet. Oh my god, I hate that.
It's been like 2 years, yeah.
Who is he? Me? Like
literally.
Like, so that what I did read of that was very strong, and I thought that had a good sense of using the medium as an excuse to just deal with more mature subject matter. You're not really in love with the gore or anything. You're just using it as like, this is how we get the R rating in a comic to depict themes of sexuality and themes of violence and the seriousness. Some of that can be a bit, and that's refreshing a lot of the times. And you can kind of feel like a lot of Batman writers or like Daredevil writers are like brushing up against what they're allowed to show, and it's just like, if they just put a horror label on it, they'll probably be able to get away with it, which I think is interesting.
I really liked when one of the people in the Discord server that Alfie and I run was talking about their thoughts on the new 52 Wonder Woman, and they didn't post my favorite scene, but one of the things about that book that was talked about a lot at the time was Brian Azzarello was writing it as if it was a horror novel. And that plus Greek gods is a good recipe. And I just remember this one scene that was so fucking good. Well, a combination of scenes, I guess. Where you go down to the underworld and you see Hades has Kronos, his father, there. And because Kronos famously ate all of his kids and they all burst out of his belly when Zeus came and freed them, Kronos is just like chained to a fucking wall. He's got just a hole in his stomach, and that's where Hades goes to have his meals and just talks to his dad the whole time that he's sitting there eating in front of him, which is so fucked up. But then when all the shit goes down in that book and you get the gods being overthrown and Hades is not killed but taken out because he's still immortal, taken out, they take him down to his father and they are feeding Hades to Kronos, and like you see like the fucking bits of the chewed up Hades like falling out of his stomach into the hole, and he just keeps screaming at them, "Feed me!" So they like keep grabbing the parts and putting it back, just like going through the fucking loop to loop of it. I'm like, oh my fucking god, it's so terrifying. Top tier. One of the scariest, most like haunting fucking images I've ever seen in a book. Great work. Brian Azzarello is kind of underrated sometimes, I feel. People shit on that Wonder Woman book a lot, but it has some pretty good stuff in it. I'm sorry, Steve, you were saying something just before I cut you off there.
Oh, no, you're good, I was just going to say, I have sort of a love-hate relationship with James Tinian's horror comics in the sense that I hate him, but then on very, very rare occasions, he does something good, and I hate myself because I kind of liked it. But most of Tinian's stuff I think is very bad because I think he's just kind of like a soulless hit engineer that just wants to sell books, not necessarily make things that are interesting ideas or personal things that are worth working out. A lot of it is just like, how do I inject the elements that will make for a really big first issue sale happen? And so a lot of his stuff kind of rubs me the wrong way. Like I don't like Something is Killing the Children. I don't like World Tree. I don't like Nice House on the Lake. But then every now and then he'll release something like Alfie was saying, like The Deviant, where I'm like, this is actually pretty good. What happened to this guy? But as much as one can shit talk Tinian, which I can do for hours and hours on end, he is very good at figuring out how to like create the perfect formula for like the slasher film equivalent of a horror comic, where he's not making The Shining, he's not making a Robert Eggers movie or something, but he is making this very sort of like serviceable pipeline of horror stories that are quick, easy to read, digestible, and occasionally have very good art or very competent techniques. Department of Truth is a book that fell off super hard after like the first 7 or 8 issues. But even so, there are like one shots here and there that are really good or really entertaining. One that I really like that's a really good effective horror story is the Mothman story in that series, where where you're reading through like the police reports and interviews of people who encounter Mothman. But the way the issue is designed is that every every page alternates between a full page of dialogue with no panels, just laid out in interview script format, and then another page that is a full page image of something happening. So you just flip through this, and you get like these really good sort of like tension building conversations about what's going on. And then on the next page, you're just seeing this eerie image that's slowly coming more and more and more to the forefront. And it's just like a solid 22-page comic. I wish he did more stuff like that and less hit engineering, but that's a good sort of like palatable, you want to read a horror comic, read like this one issue of Department of Truth. It's a lot of fun.
I love that Steve's criticism is he's too successful of a writer.
No, it's that he's not a writer. It's that he's an entrepreneur trying to make money as a writer.
So he's Todd McFarlane, but
He is
slightly
Todd
better
McFarlane.
at it.
Yeah. No, I mean
So,
he is.
So you're telling me that the legendary team up of Todd McFarlane and James Tynion might just actually kill you?
I mean, possibly. I mean,
Possibly.
the thing about
We found his kryptonite, ladies and gentlemen.
the thing about Image is like it started as artists wanting a piece of the pie, but at the end of the day, it was just "fuck you, I want to get mine," and everyone just did that. And Tinian is the natural consequence of that. Image was never really about creator ownership and creator rights. It was just about whoever shows up here, fuck you, get yours. And that's exactly what Tinian is. Tinian is, I'm going to make an empire of my own making. I'm not going to have anything to say, but God will I make money.
Good for him. You know what? Live the dream, baby. Oh man, one day we gotta talk about Image. Just the foundation of Image. It still cracks me up. Todd McFarlane. Oh, you know, they just don't respect what the publishing teams just don't respect what the creatives want to do. Grant Morrison, Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman, come write for Spawn for me. Doesn't use any of the ideas. Fucking iconic.
And the fact that it was all creator owned except for the issues of my book that other people wrote, in which case you have to sue me for them.
Yep. Pretty good stuff. Anyway. Alright. I don't really have anything to say on the audio drama side of horror. I think it can work. I just don't think it's something that, like, it's such a niche genre that I don't really want to spend time on it when we've been getting into as long as a format as we have for this episode. So, what is this, 2012? This is going to turn into a 3-hour episode? No, thank you. I've moved beyond that. Anyway, so I think that was a pretty good one. I really like a lot of what we got to discuss there and just, you know, shit talk things. Alfie feedback was too quiet, as per usual. He thinks he doesn't have anything to contribute. He's wrong.
Basically.
Nah, you're wrong. You're great. You're special. We love you.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. I don't know what we'll be talking about next time. It might be a review. It might be a discussion. We'll kind of hash that out a little bit off the mic here. But everyone, thank you so much. See you in a couple weeks. Until next time, I'm the Philosopher.
I am the champion of horror.
And I am very scared.
And we are your geeky gentlemen, and we will be discussing things.